Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, where we will be unpacking the bloody massacre of what's said to be 1,000 plus of Alawites, Christians, and other religious and ethnic minorities in Syria recently by the hands of Islamist militias, particularly those loyal to the new regime in Damascus. I'm Regan King and joined as always by my good friend and co-host Simon Barrett as we unpack not only what is going on in the present, but whether or not there is ongoing prophetic fulfillment involved in this as well. Good evening, Simon.
Good evening, Regan.
It's an amazing subject that's before us. We've been seeing Syria completely unravel. For years, we've seen instability with the previous Assad regime, but now we're looking at a new era under an Islamist who is now in the role of president, but very fractious situation, loads of infighting, militias that are acting, according to some, out of order. You can see some of the calls for the destruction of those who participated in these alleged human rights offenses. But what's your initial takeaway from what we're seeing here?
I think what we're seeing really with the fall of Assad's regime last December, which only took less than 2 weeks, with the HT forces known as the Hayat al Shams, a new Islamist organization, and its leader Jamali, is very alarming and very concerning, because on the one hand we saw the fall of President Assad's regime, and together with it that ring of fire that the Iranian regime had built up against Israel prior to October the 7th, and with Israel's emphatic military victory against Hezbollah in Lebanon has also then resulted in the collapse of President Assad's regime. And so now we have what is the collapse of the Islamic Shia Crescent influence of the Iranian influence gone, but now this new Sunni threat that is merging with the backers of Qatar and particularly Turkey that threaten Israel. But again, you know, the new face of this regime of Ahmed al-Sharaa is an understanding that the West thinks that this is a man that we can do business with. He is no longer wearing his military fatigue. He's no longer so-called associated with al-Qaeda, but now he's a kind of moderate. He's a Westerner. He's posing with Westerners, and he's the new face of the new regime in Syria, which the West thinks it can do business with. But the reality is that he's allowed his Islamist militias to carry out a massacre back on Thursday the 6th of March, killing over 1,000 Alawites and other religious minorities in clear retribution from Assad's regime and this ongoing 13-year civil war in Syria.
Yeah, and that occurred in that Syrian coastal city area of Latakia, the stronghold of Alawites and professing Christian Syrians who are there, mostly who are a part of the Alawite contingent as well. So there's some disputation as to whether those Christians were targeted for being Christian, whether they were targeted for being Alawites, but the loss of life is inarguable. The offenses against civilians, particularly singled out for being Alawites and or for being Christians, is inarguable. There's even horrifying reports of women who were told to walk naked before being shot dead, with Sunni militias asking to see identification papers to check their religion before murdering them. The mask of the new regime in Syria is Ahmed al-Sharaa, and it seems to be slipping into this particular place of a more frightening and sinister Islamist regime than even President Assad, which, while it was a secular regime as such, we can't look at this, Simon. I think there's a mistake. I'm seeing some people say, oh, well, it was better the devil we knew. Well, you know, my take on this is, well, better no devil at all. And the reality of the situation is Assad was, like you've already drawn to our attention, he was part of that crescent, that powerhouse of the Iranian regime. There's also collusion with Russia as well, routinely involved in that.
Absolutely. He's got his, I mean, President Assad has really got the Iranians and the Russians to thank,
Yes.
that he's managed to stay in power for 13 years until last December.
He survived the Arab Spring.
Hezbollah collapsed, and with the defeat of Hezbollah meant that the Iranian influence, then the Iranians didn't come to the aid of Assad, and the Russians didn't come to his aid, and essentially this led to his collapse as well. But I mean, it wouldn't be behind the headlines if we didn't have a scripture, and so the scripture on this one is linked to the fall of Damascus as described in Isaiah chapter 17 verses 1 to 3, that says the following: "The burden against Damascus, behold, Damascus will cease from being a city, and it will be a ruinous heap. The cities of Auror are forsaken. They will be flocks which lie down, and no one will make them afraid. The fortress also will cease from Ephraim, the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria. They will be as the glory of the children of Israel, says the Lord of hosts." And then we have, Regan, this prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled about the sudden destruction of Damascus, one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world.
And it's been continually inhabited, which is the key here, that it has at no point fallen into that state of utter ruin that Isaiah 17 speaks of. So this is something that we're yet to see. But we are seeing Damascus routinely beset by such destruction over the past number of years, essentially since the Arab Spring that saw the unrest completely boil over, and in the conflict that's transpired since then up to the fall of Assad on the 9th of December of 2024. We continue to see ongoing destruction of Damascus. So, and on that day, the 9th of December of 2024, the Daily Telegraph announced that fall of President Assad of Syria under the headline, "Fall of the House of Assad with a £1 billion fortune and blood on its hands. How a gangly eye doctor became a brutal dictator presiding over 13 years of carnage that claimed the lives of over 500,000 people." Make no mistake, I'm seeing a lot of people, especially some Roman Catholics, who are saying, people, evangelicals, I saw this quote from one individual and multiple others saying, evangelicals really didn't like Assad. They didn't like Assad, primarily because Assad was a massive catalyst to persecution of Christians as well.
But he also provided protection for Christians fleeing the kind of war in Iraq in 2003.
Traditional Christians.
Yeah. But he still gave them a safe haven. And that's why people are very confused when it comes to this regime, because the previous regime, because on the one hand they saw how this regime protected the ancient Christian communities in the Middle East, has given them safe haven. Even his own regime, he allowed the predominant Christian religions there to be able to operate freely, as long as obviously they didn't criticize the regime. There was peace and safety there. And now there's real danger with this new Islamist regime emerging, that the Christians could be under threat or targeted. But do you want to unpack a little bit more about President Assad?
So some would say he didn't look like a dictator. He didn't have that appearance as such. He was awkward and gangly, according to the Telegraph. I think personally these guys should study history and find a lot of dictators from history didn't have a look of a dictator, whatever one would expect a dictator to look like. His mannerisms were unassuming, but when he opened his mouth, there was great danger as a result. He didn't have the machismo of some of the other Arab strongmen like Gaddafi or Hussein. His wife Asma called him Duck, presumably because he looked a little like one, although his benighted people thought he also resembled a giraffe given his long neck. Yet when it came to butchery, he was up there with the worst of them, presiding over 13 years of carnage that claimed the lives of well over 500,000 people. If ever there was a modern ruler who epitomized Hannah Arendt's description of the banality of evil, it was surely Assad. As the end came with bewildering speed, Assad's extended family scurried for safety as quickly and stealthily as they could, seeking refuge with whichever power would have them. Few and far between, given their reputation, of course. But there we have the reality that only Russia seemed willing to come to the rescue. There was no announcement made, no big to-do. Russia is where they went.
And the Telegraph also make a very interesting point, and this in this paragraph here, that Assad reckoned his father had been right. Confronted with a violent insurrection by Islamists, part of the Muslim Brotherhood, in the city of Homs in 1982, Fassez, his father, ordered the city to be carpet bombed, a massacre estimated to have killed, or I would say probably murdered, 20,000 people unfolded. Bashar was just 16 when it happened, but the memories remained with him, and the lesson he took from the massacre was, according to the former regime insiders, by killing thousands of people, his father preserved the stability for the next 3 decades. He said there was some truth in it. Even when Syria exploded in 2011, Hamas stayed quiet, remaining in the regime's hands until the last week of the opposition forces now in charge, but it also ensued the hatred of Assad's name among many Syrian Sunnis who are very much persecuted by Assad's regime. And this is all part of the French mandate for promoting ethnic minorities to a position of leadership against the majority Sunni population, so that they would seek protection from the French, who had the mandate from the end of the First World War right up until the end of the Second World War, until Syria gains its independence. But let's have a look back now on those early days of December 2024, when the Islamist Sunni forces overthrew Assad's regime. Truly an historic moment.
Syria's streets are filled with jubilation as its people celebrate the overthrow of the dictatorial Assad regime.
Assad is gone. Thank God. Thank God.
Assad and his father ruled Syria with an iron fist for more than 5 decades. The notorious prisons where the Assad regime tortured and often murdered hundreds of thousands of dissidents have now been emptied. The deposed leader, Bashar al-Assad, is in Moscow with his family, reportedly receiving asylum from his ally. The nearly 14-year civil war was suddenly capped by a sprawling coalition of Islamic rebels racing across Syria in a 2-week sprint to capture Damascus. The main rebel group is Hayat al Shams, known as HTS. Its leader started out with Syria's version of al-Qaeda and still has a $10 million bounty on his head from the U.S.
Some of the rebel groups that took down Assad have their own grim record of terrorism and human rights abuses.
You know, we could have an Islamic State arise there, which will have profound negative implications across the region.
While many of HTS's factions seem to have moderated, and most of the rebel groups are pledging to protect Syria's religious and ethnic minorities, Biden is wary.
They're saying the right things now, but as they take on greater responsibility, we will assess not just their words, but their actions.
Some 900 U.S. troops remain in eastern Syria. Their mission is countering the brutal terrorists of ISIS.
We're clear-eyed about the fact that ISIS will try to take advantage of any vacuum.
It's been a long civil war marked by Assad committing atrocities like using chemical weapons on his own people. Major ally Russia often joined in, its jets bombing Syrian civilians. Iran and its main proxy Hezbollah also took part in slaughtering rebels. In this latest fight, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah didn't come to Assad's rescue as in the past. Russia's attention is mostly on its war with Ukraine. Israel's dismantling of Hezbollah and weakening of Iran played a major role in keeping them from saving Assad. President-elect Trump piled on, writing, "Russia and Iran are in a weakened state right now, one because of Ukraine and a bad economy, the other because of Israel and its fighting success." As for Syrian and Israeli relations, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is offering peace.
We send a hand of peace to all those beyond our border in Syria, to the Jews, to the Kurds, to the Christians, and to the Muslims who want to live in peace with Israel.
Still, the IDF rushed to take over the buffer zone around the much-disputed Golan Heights between Israel and Syria. It also struck chemical weapon sites and long-range rockets to keep them from falling into the wrong hands. Netanyahu says Israel will do whatever is necessary to protect itself.
To ensure that no hostile force embeds itself right next to the border of Israel.
Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, of course, that was a flashback to the fall of Assad's regime, which was heinous and atrocious in its undertakings across Syria. There should be no question or doubt concerning that, the fall of Assad's regime being just. But as we see very often throughout the scriptures, Simon, and we quoted earlier in relation to the fall of Damascus, very often God uses unjust people to execute his justice in these situations. We've seen that with the Babylonians, we've seen it with the Persians, we've seen it with the Greeks, we've seen it throughout, right? In this situation, we need to understand, we need to ask the question, who are these Sunni rebels that are now running Syria? No one should be under any delusion that these characters are in any way just or righteous, or that they are indeed an improvement on Assad. I don't think that they are. Some would even say that somehow, if it were possible, that they are worse than Assad. I'm not certain that I would go that far, because they have limited resources, they're not as centralized, and they also don't have the access to some of the stuff that Israel mercifully destroyed following Assad's fall. They don't have the infrastructure. However, this is a bloodthirsty group.
Absolutely. So the BBC reported back on the 9th of December 2024 under the headline, "Who are the rebels in Syria?" The BBC reported that their leader of the Islamist militant group, Hayat al Shams, known as HTS, was Abu Muhammad al-Johani. He is very much putting himself forward as the figurehead of the post-Assad future in Syria. Said without his group, and I put in brackets militia, sudden devastating advance on Aleppo, then into Homs from their power base in the northwestern province, there would be no doubt that this tumultuous events of the past week and a half would not happen. Al-Jalani has for years endeavoured to shift the perception of his organisation, one from a feared being an ideological zealotry to one that could be accepted to Syrians as a pragmatic alternative to Assad's regime. Says HTS was under a different name, Jabhat al-Nusra, in 2011 as a direct affiliate of al-Qaeda. The leader of the self-styled Islamic State group, Abu Bakr Baghdadi, was involved in its formation. The BBC go on to report that it was regarded as one of the most effective and deadly of the groups ranged against President Assad during the civil war. It was prescribed as a terror organisation by the UN, the US, Turkey and other countries, and remains so. But it says that al-Jani, now Ahmed al-Sharaa, publicly broke ranks with al-Qaeda, dissolved Jabhat al-Nusra, and set up a new organisation called Hayat al Shams, and it merged with other Islamist organisations.
There were doubts at the time, and some still remain very heavily over whether HTS has completely renounced its links with al-Qaeda. Certainly, I don't think it actually has renounced its links with jihadism. I don't believe that it has renounced its ideology of Islamism and propagating that through the sword. But its message in recent days has been well, the question is being asked as to whether or not it's been one of inclusiveness and rejection of violence or revenge. And I think we're beginning to see some clear answers to that. HTS itself remains recognized as a terror organization. And it's interesting, you know, Turkey having recognized its origins as a terror organization is quite fascinating, because Turkey is funding and channeling its own bands of militia and terrorists into Syria as well. And this is part of the problem, that there's this very diverse grouping of militias across a vast area of land that is almost impossible for any one particular grouping to control in full. Certainly HTS has in the past couple of years rebranded, and it has built up its infrastructure. It's merging with some of the other militias, has seen alliances built, but are these really going to be stable?
And it's very clear as well that there is an ideological affinity with the government in Turkey of President Erdogan, who's the Muslim Brotherhood, and HTS in Syria, as well as Hamas in Gaza as well, and the Qataris. So this is where the money's coming from. This is the aims and objective, is that power shift between the Sunnis and the Shias.
Well, this is where the money is coming from, as well as our own British government. Okay, guys, let the man do the talking here. Here's an astounding statement that's made about £50 million that has been given to the new regime in Syria from our very own David Lammy.
Well, today I'm announcing a £50 million package of support and aid to Syria. And I support the Akbar principles that were agreed yesterday. We want to see a Syrian-led and a Syrian-owned future. And we want one that is representative and inclusive. That is what partners in the region and allies, close allies, signed up to yesterday. And that's what we'll be encouraging. HTS remains a prescribed organisation, but we can have diplomatic contact, and so we do have diplomatic contact, as you would expect. We want to see a representative government, an inclusive government. We want to see chemical weapons stockpiles secured and not used, and we want to ensure that there is not continuing violence. And so for all of those reasons, using all the channels that we have available, and those are diplomatic and, of course, intelligence-led channels, we seek to deal with HTS where we have to.
So that news report was courtesy of The Times and also Reuters. Regan, what astonishes me is that this new Labour government has given £50 million of our taxpayers' money, your money and our money, and our viewers' money, to a regime it knows nothing about, in the hope that that money will be spent looking after kind of Syrian refugees, and that money could have well been spent on weapons and arms that attack the Alawite community in the north of Syria.
Yeah, our funds, our taxes, have essentially enabled terrorists. Because even if, let's suppose that that money has been spent on aid, that's money that that regime would have had to spend to some degree to buy people's favor or to keep people on side by giving aid themselves. So we've enabled them now to reallocate funds elsewhere. It's reprehensible. But I mean, the question though that we need to ask, Simon, is 3 months on, here we are 3 months on after this takeover, is the mask of HTS slipping?
No, absolutely. And the Telegraph have written an excellent article under this heading, which they reported on the 9th of March 2025. Syria's rebel leader courted the world. Now his forces stand accused of a massacre. The Telegraph report that the government has alleged already killed 750 members of the minority groups, Alawites, Christians and Jews. Only last week, Ahmed al-Sharaa was in Cairo helping to devise a viable alternative to Donald Trump's vision for Gaza. Dressed in smart Western suit, Syria's interim president was welcomed as an equal by some of the most important political leaders of the Arab world. He also met with Alastair Campbell, the former press secretary of Tony Blair, and Rory Stewart, a contender for the Conservative leadership contest, to be part of their podcast. So clearly bringing him into the kind of Western fold. It also says that it marked an extraordinary rise for the former Islamist militant, which so brilliantly defeated Bashar al-Assad in December. Since then, he's opened up Damascus to Western leaders and journalists to sell his vision of a new, stable and inclusive Syria, they go on to write. Those hopes are now on edge of ruin, given the bloodletting of minorities in the country's Mediterranean west coast since Thursday. Shara's government now stands accused of massacring members of minority groups, Alawites, Christians and Jews, in response to a series of ambushes by gunmen apparently loyal to the former regime of Bashar al-Assad. Approximately 750 civilians have been killed, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a London-based war monitor. And footage has emerged on Sunday of thousands of civilians, apparently from the minority groups seeking sanctuary of all people from President Putin at one of Russia's few remaining military bases in the country.
And yet they still do have presence there, which is also interesting on a prophetic angle as well as Turkey's involvement. But Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, condemned the radical Islamic terrorists that he said had murdered people in western Syria. Washington's reaction could be particularly damaging as Syria's fledgling government is desperate for the U.S. to lift Assad-era sanctions. It might also find itself in serious trouble if Mr. Trump withdraws the small but effective force of roughly 2,000 U.S. troops stationed in the east of the country who currently keep Islamic State at bay. Israel has lost no time in blaming the new Islamist rulers in Damascus for the barbaric murder of civilians while quietly expanding its military operations in the country's south, largely free from international scrutiny. Although I think this is an unfair and slightly insidious way of reporting this, Israel's actions have been widely publicized by Israel itself as a necessity to protect the ethnic minority Druze with whom Israel has a pact of peace for their own security. And so this is something that we have to recognize is for the well-being of those Druze people. Now, Sharaa has now called for a national committee to investigate violence which is occurring on Sunday, saying, "We have to preserve national unity and domestic peace. We can live together." Albeit, here we're talking about this, it doesn't sound like a particularly unified Syria by any means.
I mean, he went on to say, speaking at a mosque in his childhood neighborhood of Mazar in Damascus, he added, "Rest assured about Syria. This country has the characteristics for survival. What is currently happening in Syria is within the expected changes." And they state that the regime was desperate to convince the outside world that it would not allow Syria to become the next Iraq. It has been devastating in the last few days. And they've got an expert from the Royal United Services Institute, Dr. Burku, who said the following: "The nightmarish violence and revenge killing that targeted the Alawite villages in Syria's coastal areas of Latakia and Tarus are a warning in real time about the fragility of the security situation in Syria. It is also a reminder of the existential challenges that the interim government in Damascus faces as it centralizes security services under severe distress."
There are several tiers made up of rebel factions under the top HTS command, each with varying levels of loyalty to the center. The hardliner jihadi, mainly foreign fighters, are the farthest away from the central command structure controlled by Sharaa and the most dangerous as well. And we're seeing that there are some reports that this latest round of violence has actually undermined Sharaa.
And the Daily Mail reported the massacre under this headline: "Horror in Syria as naked women are paraded and shot dead. More than 1,000 killed in just 2 days as the country is gripped by deadly violence between the new rulers and Assad loyalists. More than 1,000 Syrians have been killed in just 2 days in brutal revenge killings as the conflict-ridden nation is gripped by bloody clashes between the new rulers and the loyalists of the ousted President Bashar al-Assad." It says the British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said in addition to the 745 civilians, mostly killed in massacres, 125 government security forces members and 148 militants with armed groups affiliated with Assad's former regime have been killed. It added that electricity and drinking water have been cut off in large areas around the city of Latakia. Violent clashes which erupted on Thursday, which is the 6th of March, are some of the deadliest since the Syrian conflict began 14 years ago and marked a major escalation in the challenge to the new government in Damascus 3 months after insurgents took authority after removing Assad from power. They said that witnesses reveal how women were reportedly told to walk naked before being shot amid horrifying scenes in Syria. The government has said that they were responding to attacks from remnant Assad's forces and blamed individual actions for rampant violence. The revenge killings are started by a Sunni Muslim gunman loyal to the government against members of Assad's minority Alawite sect are a major blow to Hayat al Shams, the faction that led the overthrow of the former government. The Alawites made up a large part of Assad's support base for decades. So let's have a look at this CBN News report that reports on the massacre that took place against the Alawites and other religious minorities back on Thursday, the 6th of March.
Days of mass killings in Syria, led by the new government, left at least more than 1,000 Alawites and Christian minority members dead and thousands of others fleeing.
The suffering is very high. It is a complete extermination of the Alawite sect, of our brothers, the Christians, of our brothers, the Shiite.
Some survivors told us that many men were shot dead in front of their families.
Syria's military says the killing is over for now and calm seems to have returned.
Thank God, today life has returned and people have gone back to their homes. Everything is, thank God, perfectly fine.
Syria's new leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, has called for a commission of inquiry and insists the massacres of mostly civilians were not acts of ethnic cleansing, but the crushing of rebel forces attacking the new government. While much of the world's media ignored these mass killings, Israel blasted the radical Islamists now in charge of Syria.
The international community must come to its sense about the regime in Damascus. It's actually about jihad. This is a massacre the whole world should condemn. This is what an ethnic cleansing really looked like.
Israeli forces struck dozens of Syrian military targets Monday night that could prove a threat to the Jewish state. IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir toured the new buffer zone his troops have set up on Mount Hermon and Syrian territory around it. Israel warned Syria's new Islamist government to keep its forces away from Israel.
We are concerned about those jihadist monsters committing a massacre and ethnic cleansing of Jews and Druze within our borders. We will not allow the formation of jihadist threat on our borders with Syria.
But in a sign it's trying to at least appear more moderate, Syria's radical Islamist government signed a deal this week with leaders of the huge Syrian Kurds minority, which had been repressed by the former Assad regime.
The agreement marks a significant step towards unifying Syria, putting an end to the country's 14 years of fracture.
Kurds and their allies are celebrating.
All the people are happy, and they're all one hand. Kurds, Christians, Assyrians, and all other sects. We are all brothers in one country.
And on today's programme, we're joined by Dr. David Wormser, who's a former advisor to Dick Cheney in the White House and is joining us from Washington, D.C. David, warm welcome to Behind the Headlines.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
Pleasure. And David, would you just give us your expertise on what you sense is happening in Syria, particularly in light of the fall of President Assad's regime and the new leader of Syria, who's actually emerging? Is he someone that the West can actually negotiate with, or should we be very concerned about his Islamist credentials?
Well, I think we should be concerned. I think we have to differentiate a little bit between Julani the person or Ahmed Sharaa the person and the overall situation on two levels. First of all, Ahmed Sharaa, we know nothing about him in terms of where he really is right now. He clearly is behaving in a way to portray moderation, but it's very slick. I would say almost too slick. He's clearly being advised by the Qataris and the Turks to behave a certain way, with probably some of the best public relations advisors helping him. But we have rarely seen a true ideologue who was an Islamist on the level of al-Qaeda turn to a third way. We've seen Islamists who have turned against Islamism, but they are very decisive. It's sort of like with communism. You had communists who turned against communism, and it was very decisive. You could tell. There was no third way. There was no communism with a human face or a third way communism. And as a result, I have a feeling that that's a litmus test to see where Ahmed al-Sharaa is. The second thing is that he is in a revolution, and in the Middle East and generally, revolutions rarely are one-step processes. You have the initial process of takeover and destruction, and the second process where true forces underneath come out to play. We saw that in the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, where it was a two-step process. So I wouldn't put so much focus on what we think Ahmed al-Sharaa is right now. I would focus more on the underlying tectonics. And those tectonics tell us that there are strong forces at work, both within the Islamist camp and within Turkey, which in Qatar on one side, on the other side, a strong centrifugal environment in Syria and Lebanon, which is breaking up along ethnic lines, which is a general trend we've seen in the Middle East over the last 20, 30 years.
And Dr. Wormser, one of the confusing elements of this conflict is some conflicting reports in recent days from different sectors of alleged massacre against the Alawites, including many Christians. Some say 750, some say 1,000, some say as many as 7,000 have been slaughtered by HTS troops. Is this credible, and do you think that this might be the mask of HTS and its leadership slipping?
I think that something did happen. The exact circumstances of what we know and the parameters of which are much more difficult to obtain. Clearly there were large numbers of not only Alawites, but apparently some Christians who were killed. The Christians especially would raise questions as to whether it was really retribution or response to a uprising. Possibly, we don't know. The Alawites are a little more suspicious given their previous relationship with Iran and with Russia. But even there, what we're seeing is clear evidence that there were indiscriminate killings of Alawites and of Christians in significant numbers. So yes, I think it does let slip not the face of, again, the leader, al-Sharaa necessarily, but of the movement that he heads, which is really a strong Islamist movement. The second thing is it lifts the face of Turkey, because what we're seeing, especially in the Alawite areas, are not Arab Sunnis under Giuliani's control operating only. We are seeing Turkic people's Islamists coming from as far away as the Uyghurs or other areas of Central Asia, obviously being brought in by Turkey. And in many ways, they're the more dangerous and more deadly militias that are operating out there. And the real power right now along the coast, maybe not in the center in Damascus, but along the coast. So I think what you're seeing here is both some level of official tolerance of response to what Ahmed al-Sharaa thought was an attack by the Alawites, but underneath an orgy of hatred emerging and erupting, not by Syrians necessarily who were victimized by the previous government, but by, again, Turkish Islamists that were brought in by Turkey into the areas down from the Hatay province into the Alawite areas. So I think that's probably the best way to understand it. Again, it shows one central thing, though. Syria right now, any attempt to create a unified state with a strong central government will result in ethnic massacres. At this point, the best we can hope for is a confederal structure, or maybe even autonomous governments, or maybe even a breakup of Syria. That's the only way you're going to guarantee the rights of these minorities.
And David, could you explain for us, please, Israel's situation in this, extending their military influence in the no-go zone between the Golan Heights, which is on Israel's side, and the border with Syria, and also forming an alliance with the Druze to actually protect the Jewish community from any attack from HTS. And in particular, we've also seen that Druze members have actually gone from Israel into Syria and vice versa, the first time that we've seen that probably since before the Six-Day War back in June of 1967.
True. First of all, the Druze have had a rough time, both under the previous government under Assad and over the last decade. They've faced several massacres, even very close to where Israel is in the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. But now they also are terrified. In many ways, this is the ultimate verdict on the Ahmed al-Sharaa government. Is the minorities see it as a threat. They don't see it as the way Westerners seem to appear to think that it's more moderate. Proof is in the pudding, and the people who are closest to the fire are saying we're burning. And that's the Druze, that's the Kurds, that's the Alawites. But going back to the Druze, it's a very complex question. First of all, Israel has been attacked incessantly by Syria since October 7th, really the night of October 7th. So Israel has obviously great concern with what weapons and forces are operating on the other side of the border. Now, with a new government, you have another dimension to the problem, which is, while true, Hezbollah has been dealt a terrible blow, Hamas operatives and other Islamists who call for the destruction of Israel are showing up in the cabinet of the new government of al-Sharaa. And of course, the Israelis don't want another Gaza-type situation under the border in the north, so they're creating a buffer zone to protect themselves from that. The second thing is there's clearly a strategic threat being posed by Turkey, not because Israel's decided it doesn't like Turkey, but because Turkey itself has declared neo-imperialist ambitions and a recreation of the Ottoman Empire, and has again and again expressed quite sharp hostility to Israel, and is now funding, supporting, and encouraging movements in Syria that look to Israel as an illegitimate entity and call for the liberation of Jerusalem. Moreover, the Turks themselves have called for the liberation of Jerusalem and the raising of an army to invade to liberate Jerusalem. So the Israelis have every reason to believe there's a threat coming from Turkey. And the new positions Israel has are defense positions that help Israel better deal with the possibility not only of the immediate threat akin to October 7th that Hamas and Islamist forces are operating across their border are posing, but also the longer-term strategic threat that could be posed by Turkey. The Golan Heights, Mount Hermon up there, is basically a gold mine for surveillance of the entire Syrian and Israeli areas, and Jordanians as well.
That's very helpful in perspective. You mentioned earlier the possibility of some confederation, and maybe this might be the only way to help protect the many minorities across Syria. I mean, how stable actually is the power that the new government, if we can call it that, actually is? That there are at least 10 militia groups that I'm aware of that are still active. Syria is a massive land area. Does this new government actually have a significant degree of power?
Excellent question. No, I don't believe it does. I think that what's happening, it's not only the Kurds, the Druze, the Alawites who don't want to give up power. Well, the Alawites and Christians don't really have much right now, but the Druze and the Kurds. What you're seeing is, as you said, the government is a construction of very many Islamist militias, essentially. And these Islamist militias, many of them are ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Unfortunately, most likely you'll see the freeing of, or the release of prisoners that the Kurds are holding, which are ISIS, some of the most hardcore ISIS terrorists. You're seeing Turkish Islamists who are terrorists flowing into Syria. Syria is not a stable government at all, And as I said, I don't believe the construction of the government as you see it now will be the final resting place of the government. I think you're going to see a two-step process where its real radical essence comes out and asserts its control over all institutions of the government. So no, I don't think it's stable at all, and I don't think I think it's quite valid that the Kurds and the Druze are terrified and are seeking protection. And of course, the greatest protection is right now from Israel. It was the government of Israel that essentially destroyed the foundations of security of the Syrian government that allowed these guys to swarm in. Unfortunately, HTS, the government of Syria and so forth, believe it was their Islamist faith and their Islamist ideology that delivered them this victory in the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, which has great evocative spiritual and dangerous connotations. But they believe it's now a validation of the Islamist Sunni Salafi threat to secularism in the region, to Arab nationalism, to everything that they oppose, including Israel, the West, Russia, and so forth. So what we're seeing is both an ideological toxic concoction emerging, as well as a mess, power-wise, which will allow those with initiative, guns, and cruelty to prevail.
David, we want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind Headlines tonight. Thank you for giving your expertise, and we really value it. And it'd be great to see you back in the White House and advising President Trump and the administration on the Middle East. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we're very grateful for that interview and that expertise. It's fantastic to have someone like Dr. David Wurmser on the program, and many thanks to him. Simon, unpacking a little bit more of this massacre that has transpired. Residents of Banias, one of the town's worst hit by the violence, have said that bodies were strewn on the streets or left unburied in homes and on the roofs of buildings, nobody being able to collect them. One witness said that the gunmen prevented residents for hours from removing the bodies of 5 of their neighbors killed Friday at close range. A reminder, these are civilians who are being targeted not by or as collateral damage by two warring factions or by bombing of a place where there are enemy militants. These are civilians who are being murdered in their own houses at close range.
Absolutely, and there has been social media footage, for example,
Yes.
seen on kind of social media of these Islamist forces just opening fire on the houses belonging to the Alawites, and clearly this is done in retribution because they see the Alawites as the ones that oppressed them under Assad's regime, and now they're having payback. So a little bit more of the account that occurred back on the 6th of March. It says here that they forcibly brought people down from the streets, then lined them up and started shooting them. A resident of Bay Anasan told Sky News. They left nobody. They left nobody at all. The scene that I saw was pure horror, just indescribable. And then it also talks about Ali Ashiba, who was a 57-year-old resident of Banias, who fled with his family and neighbours after the violence broke out on Friday, and that would have been the 8th, said at least 20 of his neighbours and colleagues in one neighbourhood of Banias where Alawites live were killed, and some of them in their shops and some of them in the homes. So Sheba called the attacks revenge killings of the Alawite minority for crimes committed by Assad's government. Other residents said that the government included foreign fighters and militants from neighbouring villages and towns, said it was very, very bad. Bodies were on the streets. He was saying as he fled his home and was 12 miles away from the city. He said that gunmen were gathering less than 100 metres from his apartment building, firing randomly at homes and residents, and in at least one incident he knows of, asked the residents for their ID to check their religion and their sect before killing them. The observatory chief, Rami, said revenge killings stopped early on Sunday. This was one of the biggest massacres during the Syrian conflict, he said, about killing Alawite civilians.
Yeah, this is something that we're going to continue to, I'm sure, see more of the truth unravel. We can't forget that there has at times been a shrouding of what is true because of blocks on social media and various narratives that have been, but what we're seeing now is a great deal of what is being put out. It's revealing a significant amount. We have to be careful, of course, because there's also, as Dr. Vermser was saying, that element of the Alawite community. They're going to have a particular angle that they are presenting because they desire to be back in power. They desire also, they would be very happy with Assad to be back because he was one of them. And so we can't just accept everything that we're hearing willingly, but the video footage speaks for itself.
But clearly it shows the unmasking the lies of HTS, saying 100%. That they would be inclusive, saying that they would protect ethnic and religious minorities. And if, for example, the new leader of Syria, the new president, if he really did want to reach out to the West, would be seeking to protect Alawites and other religious minorities from the Islamists to show that that Syria has moved on, that Syria is under a new regime that's looking to reconcile itself with the West, to remove sanctions against the regime, and to show a new face would be looking at its fruit. And clearly the fruits of this regime is violence, and the mask of deception has truly been unveiled with this massacre against the Alawites.
And the JNS has reported under a headline very similar to what you've just said, that the new Syrian regime's mask has fallen. This is indeed our primary question in relation to our program this evening, Simon. The massacre of Alawites highlights the danger of radical Islam's rise to power, Israeli officials and analysts warn. The indiscriminate slaughter of Alawite civilians in Syria by Islamist gunmen affiliated with the country's new Sunni Muslim regime has led to urgent questions about the nature of the government taking shape northeast of Israel. The mask has fallen, but let's look at things in a slightly broader perspective. Dina Lisniansky, an expert on the Middle East and radical Islamic movements and a research fellow at Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, told JNS on Wednesday. For decades, she noted, Syria's Sunni majority had been under the control of a small Alawite minority. The rule of the Alawites manifested itself during the rule of the Assad dynasty, and in their effort to impose an absolute dictatorship, they massacred a great many Sunnis, according to Lisniansky. This policy of mass killing shaped the course of the civil war that began in 2011 as dictator Assad tried to stabilize Alawite rule. And so essentially what we're seeing here in effect is the hunter becoming the hunted. That's what's being portrayed here. Assad and the Alawites were against the Sunnis and ostracized the Sunnis. And now we've seen this so many times in the Middle East. This is a form of justice that is all too well known to history in this region, wherein the tables have turned and there's
absolutely. But it's important to get Israel's perspective on this, considering that Israel has a border with the new Syrian regime next to Israel on the Golan Heights.
Absolutely.
So on Tuesday, the Deputy Foreign Minister, and we know her well, Sharon Haskell, warned that the international community must understand that this is ethnic cleansing and the current Syrian regime has taken its mask and revealed its true nature, a radical jihadist organization. She went on to attack the international community and the international response by saying, you won't see marches in the streets of London or New York. No one will fight for the murdered Alawites. No one will demonstrate in the streets of Paris to protect families being slaughtered. No one will set up a camp at Columbia University to save the Christians or Druze community in Syria. And then we see that Defense Minister Israel Katz visited the peak of Mount Hermon last Tuesday, arriving at the IDF outpost, in which he said the following. Every morning when Jilani al-Sharaa opens his eyes in the presidential palace in Damascus, he will see the IDF watching him from the heights of Mount Hermon, and remember that we are here and in all the security zones of southern Syria, to protect the residents of the Golan and the Galilee from any threat posed by him and his jihadi associates. He went on to say that the IDF is preparing for an indefinite stay in Syria. We will hold the security zone and Mount Hermon and ensure that all security areas in southern Syria are demilitarized and free of weapons and threats, and we will protect the safety of the Druze in the region.
Yeah, it's clear, isn't it, that the mask has well and truly slipped. The new interim president of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa, he's revealed clearly as a dangerous and evil Islamist dictator who is threatening his own religious and ethnic minorities as well as Israel's security. A leopard cannot change his spots. Western leaders shouldn't be deceived.
Absolutely.
And, you know, people can't fall into the trap of, well, because we don't have a monster like Assad in power anymore, this guy must be better, or this guy. That's not necessarily the case. And
absolutely, and of course we've seen silence from the Church of England and the Vatican against these massacres against the Alawites, and also I believe that 12 has been reported that 12 Christians in Syria have also been murdered by Islamists. But the big question is, will HTS lead to the destruction of Damascus, as mentioned in Isaiah 17, because this prophecy has yet to be fulfilled. And if he is mobilizing an army together with the Turks and the Qataris to launch an invasion of northern Israel, then woe betide him and his leadership in Damascus, because Damascus will no longer be a city, it'll be in a ruinous heap.
Yeah, the elements that we're seeing play out around definitely point to everything building up around the world. And that's why we need to view things through the lens of Scripture, not through the lens of how we want things to be or what we would prefer things to be, but through the lens of Scripture, that we're headed to times of even greater trouble. Who will stand in the end? Who will endure to the end? Those who are faithful, who continue to look to Jesus Christ, who know his power, who continue to proclaim his excellency. So Simon, we shouldn't be afraid of this. We should be aware, but we shouldn't fear, because we have a new spirit that the Lord has placed within us. And that's the same for Syrian believers and those in the contested regions.
And also we know that the Lord God of Israel will protect Israel from any Islamist threats coming from Syria, with the threat of that ancient prophecy in Isaiah 17 that talks about the destruction of Damascus. We should all be watchmen and women on the walls of Jerusalem, praying and interceding regarding the new threats that Israel's facing, particularly from this new regime in Syria, but also to speak up on behalf of Christians and other religious minorities who are being targeted by this new Islamist regime. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.